My name is Liam, and I grew up in what most would call a typical middle-class family. My mom was an accountant at a local firm, and my dad worked as a project manager for a construction company. But then there was Emma, my younger sister by 3 years. She was always the golden child in our household, the one who could do no wrong. For me, it was a different story. You're the oldest, Liam. Set a better example for Emma, my mom would say every day. Whether it was about keeping my room clean, getting good grades, or just behaving, I was always expected to do more, to be more. I remember this one evening when Emma and I were sitting at the dining table, both doing our homework. I was struggling through a complicated calculus problem, while Emma was doodling in her notebook. "I can't do this essay. It's too hard," Emma complained. Mom walked in from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. "Oh, sweetie, it's okay. You're trying your best. Maybe you can finish it tomorrow when you're feeling more inspired." I couldn't help but roll my eyes. I distinctly remembered how different the response was when I struggled with an assignment just last week. "Is something funny, Liam?" Mom asked, her voice suddenly sharp. "No, nothing," I replied, trying to hold back the frustration. I knew what was coming. I just needed to focus on my own work. After all, I had to maintain my grades if I wanted to get into a good college. Princeton. It was my dream school. Their computer science program was legendary, and I worked harder than anyone to get in. But when I brought it up to my parents, they immediately shut it down. "Be realistic, Liam," my dad had said one night at dinner. "Private colleges are expensive. We need to save for Emma's education. She might need extra support. Your grades are fine. You'll get into a state school just fine." I stared at the Princeton brochure in my hand that night, my heart sinking. The dreams I'd worked so hard for seemed to be slipping away. But then I made a decision. I wasn't going to let their limitations hold me back. If I wanted something, I would have to fight for it. I threw myself into my studies at State University, determined to prove that I could make it on my own terms. The pressure from my family was relentless, but instead of letting it drag me down, I used it as fuel to push myself harder. I wasn't going to let anyone define what I could achieve. While Emma was living comfortably at home, with my parents doting on her, I was grinding away. I spent long nights in the computer lab, debugging code when most students were out partying or socializing. I was obsessed with programming, consumed by it. But it wasn't just about grades. There was something bigger, something I couldn't shake off. I'd noticed how many people struggled to manage their daily tasks, how they could never seem to stay on top of things. One night, while pulling yet another late session in the lab, I had an idea. A simple app one that could change the way people organized their daily lives. Taskmaster. It was a concept that wouldn't leave my mind. I started sketching out the framework, working on it whenever I had a spare moment. During the weekends, when others were out with friends, I was coding. During holidays, I was debugging. It became my passion, my obsession. By the time I graduated, I had a functioning prototype, but the real challenge was just beginning. I could have taken the easy route, accepted the job offers that were rolling in from different tech companies, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was meant for something more. So I took the risk. I decided to pitch my app to the tech giants. Most of the companies turned me down. Some did so politely, but one stood out. I remember the day clearly, the day I stepped into the boardroom and presented Taskmaster. The executives in their sharp suits barely looked at me, their faces unreadable. But then, one of them, the CEO, tested the app. "This is impressive work," he said, leaning forward, his tone serious. "Very impressive." The negotiations that followed were intense, but eventually, I walked away with a check for $5 million. It felt surreal, holding that check, knowing how hard I had worked for this moment. My heart raced as I stared at the number in my bank account. I couldn't believe it. The first thing I did was buy myself a modest, but nice apartment. The second thing was to start my own mobile app development company. I wasn't going to blow this opportunity. The rest went into savings and investments. I wasn't about to become like everyone else who squandered their newfound wealth. When I told my family about the deal, the reactions were interesting. Mom had to sit down when I told her, and Dad just shook his head. "Emma?" She stared at me, her expression unreadable. The dynamic had shifted. I wasn't just Liam anymore, the responsible, hard-working son. I was now Liam the millionaire, And that's when things started to change. 2 years had passed since the big deal with the tech company, and my life had changed in ways I couldn't have imagined. My company was growing, and so was my wealth. I wasn't just a success in my own eyes anymore. I had proved it to the world. But as the saying goes, success brings attention. And that attention, as I quickly discovered, came from unexpected places, my family. It all started when Emma announced that she was getting married. She was sitting across from me at the dinner table, a wide smile on her face. "I'm getting married," she exclaimed, her voice full of excitement. I was genuinely happy for her. Tom, her fiancé, seemed like a good guy, and she looked happier than I'd seen her in years. Without hesitation, I offered to give her $20,000 for her wedding, knowing that weddings can be expensive. She grinned, thanking me, and I felt good about helping her out. But then, the requests started to shift. "Liam, weddings these days are so expensive," Emma said one afternoon. "Tom and I were looking at this amazing resort for our honeymoon in the Maldives. It's perfect, and we'd love it if you could help us with that too." At first, I didn't mind. It was Emma's wedding after all, a once-in-a-lifetime event. So, after some discussion, I agreed. I would pay for their honeymoon, in addition to the $20,000 I had already offered for the wedding. But it didn't stop there. It became a pattern. Every time I gave something, there was an undercurrent of something more. A few months later, I bought Mom a designer handbag for her birthday. She smiled, but then she casually mentioned, "You know, I saw a nicer one at that luxury boutique downtown." It was a small comment, but it stung. I wasn't just buying things for the sake of it anymore. I was being measured. Every gift, every gesture felt like it wasn't enough. Then, Dad asked me to help with some car repairs. It was a hefty $1,000 for a new transmission. I helped out, but he laughed and said, "You know, for someone who makes millions, you're pretty tight with your wallet. You could have thrown in a little extra for the new tires." It was subtle, but the message was clear. It wasn't just about helping anymore. It was about how much I could give, how much I was expected to give. It felt like the more I gave, the more they expected. Around the same time, Emma and Tom came back from their honeymoon, and I noticed something odd. They were still living with Mom and Dad. It didn't make sense to me. Tom had a decent job in finance, and Emma had started working as a marketing coordinator. They both had the means to live independently, so why were they still at home? "Have you guys considered looking for your own place?" I asked Emma one day, while helping her clean her cluttered room, the same room she had kept since high school. Have you seen rental prices lately?" she replied, rolling her eyes. "We'd be throwing away money. I don't want to waste money on rent when we could be saving up for something bigger." I couldn't understand it. Here she was, surrounded by designer clothes, bags, and accessories, all while complaining about the cost of living on her own. I couldn't help but feel that this was just another way to push the responsibility onto me. And then it happened. One Sunday afternoon, I walked into Mom and Dad's house unannounced. I had a spare key, and I liked stopping by sometimes. But what I walked into was anything but ordinary. Mom, Dad, Emma, and Tom were all gathered around the dining room table. There were papers everywhere, mortgage printouts, listings for houses. The moment I stepped inside, they scrambled to hide the papers, but it was too late. I'd already seen what they were looking at. "Liam, we didn't expect you today," Mom said, trying to sound casual, but her voice was too bright, too forced. "Everything okay?" I asked, my heart racing. I had a sinking feeling that something wasn't right. "Oh, everything's fine," Emma chirped, but there was something off in her voice, something I couldn't quite place. I didn't press it. If they were looking at houses, maybe they were finally ready to move out. I told myself it was none of my business, but as the days went on, the pressure continued to mount. 2 weeks later, I received a phone call from Mom. "Liam, we need to have an important family discussion. Can you come over tomorrow evening?" I didn't know what to expect, but when I walked into the living room the next evening, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Mom and Dad were sitting on the couch. Emma and Tom were in the armchairs, and the empty seat in the center of the room was clearly meant for me. "Liam," Emma began, her voice serious, "Tom and I have decided it's time for us to have our own home." "Good for you," I said, genuinely pleased. "It's definitely the right decision." But then Emma exchanged a glance with Mom and Dad, and the mood shifted. "Well," she paused, looking me in the eye, "since you're so successful now, and you have all that money, we were thinking it makes sense for you to buy us a house." The words hit me like a ton of bricks. I stared at her, disbelief washing over me. What? Emma continued, her voice calm but insistent. You have your own beautiful apartment, while Tom and I are stuck here. We can't afford to buy anything. You can. It makes sense, doesn't it? You should buy us a house. I couldn't process it. My heart raced as I sat there, feeling like I was in some twisted version of reality. My own sister, my family was asking me to buy them a home, and the worst part? They all agreed. Mom and Dad nodded as though this was a reasonable request. It was like the world I knew was crumbling in front of me. I could barely breathe as I sat there, the weight of their request pressing down on me like a vice. You want me to buy you a house? I asked, my voice shaking. I looked from Emma to Mom and Dad, each of them nodding, as if this was the most natural thing in the world. It felt like I had entered some bizarre alternate reality, where my family no longer recognized me for who I was, but only for what I could give them. I tried to keep my cool, my mind racing as I processed everything. I can't believe you're asking me this, I finally said, my voice barely above a whisper. Emma, sitting across from me, leaned forward. Liam, it's not that hard to understand. You have millions in the bank, and Tom and I are struggling to make ends meet. It's not fair that you get to live in your own place while we're still stuck here. You have the means to help us, so you should. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. The nerve, the audacity. For the first time in my life, I felt a surge of anger rise in me. Anger at Emma, at Mom, at Dad. This wasn't about helping family anymore. It was about them using me, expecting me to foot the bill for their poor decisions. I stood up, my chair scraping against the hardwood floor, the sound sharp and final. I'm done, I said, my voice steady but filled with disbelief. This is ridiculous. Mom immediately stood up, her face twisting with anger. How can you be so selfish, Liam? You're our son. You've made all this money, and now you're refusing to help your family? I shook my head, the anger boiling over. I've worked my ass off to get where I am, Mom. I built this company. I didn't sit around expecting someone else to give me a handout, and I sure as hell am not going to be your personal ATM. But the words didn't seem to faze her. Her eyes were filled with disappointment, the same look she had given me countless times growing up when I didn't live up to her impossible standards. You're being so stingy, she said, her voice cold. I raised you to be better than this. That was the final straw. I looked around the room at the people who were supposed to be my family, my support system. Instead, I saw nothing but a group of people who saw me as a walking bank account. I've given more than enough, I said, my voice low but firm. I paid for Emma's wedding and honeymoon. I've bought you gifts, helped you with bills, and now you want me to buy you a house? I let out a bitter laugh, shaking my head in disbelief. You're just jealous, Liam, Emma said, her voice sharp with accusation. You're jealous because I'm happily married, and you're just alone with your money. You're pathetic. Her words hit me like a slap across the face, and I felt my hands ball into fists at my sides. Jealous? The first spat. I'm not jealous, Emma. I've spent years trying to prove myself to you, to all of you, and you've never once appreciated it. You don't even see me. You only see what I can give you. I'm not going to keep doing this. Dad, who had been silent until then, spoke up, his voice heavy with disappointment. What kind of son are you, Liam? How can you be so heartless? This is family, and you're turning your back on us. His words cut deep, but I didn't let them break me. I had to stay firm. I couldn't let their guilt trips work on me anymore. A heartless son would be one who enables bad behavior, I said, my voice steady. But the anger was still there. You don't get to manipulate me into doing what you want just because you're family. I've spent my whole life trying to earn your approval, but not anymore. I'm done. With that, I grabbed my bag, walked to the door, and left. The angry voices of my family followed me out into the driveway, but I didn't look back. I didn't care anymore. This wasn't the family I had worked so hard for. This was a group of people who only cared about what I could do for them, and I wasn't going to be their punching bag anymore. I drove home that night with a heavy heart. I didn't know what I was feeling: relief, anger, sadness, maybe all three. It was hard to say goodbye to a family that had raised me, but at the same time, it felt like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. I had finally stood up for myself, even if it meant losing everyone I had once thought I could count on. The first few weeks after I left my family were the hardest. My phone buzzed constantly with messages and calls from Mom, Dad, and Emma, each of them trying to guilt trip me into coming back, into giving them what they demanded. I didn't answer at first, letting the messages pile up, but eventually, curiosity got the best of me, and I skimmed through them. Mom's first message read, "How dare you walk out on your family like that? After everything we've done for you." I stared at the message, my stomach turning. "After everything we've done for you." That line haunted me. They had done things for me, but they had never given me the unconditional love and support I needed. They had always kept score. Everything was transactional. And now, it was clear to me there was no more room for me in their lives, unless I was providing for them in some way. The turning point came one night, when I couldn't take the pressure anymore. I called Mom, my heart racing with anger and frustration. "What exactly have you done for me, Mom?" I asked, my voice tight with emotion. "When I needed you, you told me to figure it out myself. When I wanted to go to Princeton, you shut it down. I had to work 3 jobs in college to afford my own place while you saved for Emma's education. You didn't help me, and now you expect me to give you everything?" She started yelling, the familiar tirade of disappointment and shame echoing in my ears. But I had heard it all before, and this time, it didn't affect me. I had no intention of apologizing. After the call, I blocked everyone. I blocked Mom, Dad, Emma, even Tom, every single one of them. And for the first time in my life, I felt a sense of freedom. I was no longer their puppet, no longer tied to their expectations. The following months were a whirlwind of change. I threw myself into my work even more, but I also made time for myself. For the first time, I wasn't answering to anyone but me. I started seeing a therapist, someone who could help me process everything I'd been through, and slowly, I began to heal. I also took up new hobbies. I went rock climbing with a group of friends, something I would have never tried before. When Jessica, one of my old friends, suggested a spontaneous trip to Paris, one jumped at the chance. I wasn't going to sit back anymore, waiting for my family's approval or waiting for the perfect moment. I was going to live my life on my own terms. It wasn't just about what I was doing, though. It was about who I was becoming. I started mentoring young programmers, especially girls who reminded me of the version of myself I used to be: eager, ambitious, but still held back by the weight of others' expectations. I joined a women's entrepreneurship network and a book club, finding a community that valued me for who I was, not what I could give them. One year after I walked away from my family, I received an invitation to my cousin Tommy's wedding. I knew Mom, Dad, and Emma would be there, and I wasn't sure how I'd feel about it. The thought of seeing them again still triggered a knot in my stomach, but it wasn't fear anymore. It was more like curiosity about how I'd handle the situation now that I had made peace with myself. I went. When I walked into the venue, I could feel the tension in the air. They were all there, sitting at the table, and for a moment, it felt like nothing had changed. But then I saw Aunt Linda, and the warmth in her smile was a reminder of what truly mattered. I took my seat next to her, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I belonged. The conversations were light, the toasts were sweet, and when Mom got up to give one of her infamous speeches, I didn't feel that familiar wave of dread. I felt detached. As the evening went on, I realized how far I had come. I wasn't the same person who had begged for their approval, who had done everything they asked of me just to feel loved. I had built a life for myself, one where I didn't have to justify my choices to anyone. I was enough, just as I was. Later, I got a message from Rachel, one of my cousins. "Liam," she said, "you need to see this." She sent me a screenshot of my mom's Facebook post. It read, "With heavy hearts, John and I are officially disowning our eldest son, Liam. His selfishness and greed have shown us that he cares more about money than family. From this day forward, we have only one son, our beloved Emma." I felt no anger, no regret. The decision had been made for me long ago, and this was just their final act of control. So I blocked them, all of them, every single one. Months passed, and I continued to focus on my business, my health, my happiness. I didn't chase after relationships that drained me. I began to surround myself with people who genuinely cared for me, not because of what I could give them, but because of who I was. Eventually, I received a call from Aunt Linda. "Liam, your mom's been trying to reach you. She says it's urgent. She's desperate," she said, her voice tinged with concern. Before I could respond, My phone buzzed with an unknown number. I knew it was Mom, I answered. Liam, she said, her voice thick with tears. Everything's falling apart. We're going to lose the house. We used it as collateral for Daisy's wedding loan, and now we can't make the payments. Please, we need your help. You're our only hope. I almost laughed. I'm your only hope? You made your choice, Mom. You made it clear when you turned your back on me. You wanted to play this game, and now you're going to live with the consequences. I hung up, a bitter taste in my mouth, but this time I felt nothing but clarity. Their manipulation was so obvious, so transparent. It wasn't my responsibility to fix their problems. They had made their bed, and it was time for them to lie in it. I looked at myself in the mirror that night, and for the first time in years, I saw the man I had become. I had freed myself from the suffocating hold of my family. I had found peace, independence, and, most importantly, self-respect. I was no longer defined by their expectations or demands. And as I took a deep breath and smiled at the reflection staring back at me, I realized that walking away wasn't an ending. It was the beginning of a new chapter, a chapter where I was finally free to live life on my own terms. Story 2. When I walked into the living room that morning, the words slipped out of David's mouth like a knife to my chest. Either get a job or get out. I'm sick of supporting a woman like you. It felt like the ground beneath me had been ripped away. He wasn't angry, just cold, like a switch had been flipped. My mind raced, but all I could hear was the silence that followed, punctuated only by his breathing. I had always supported David. We were a team at least. That's what I thought. He worked long hours as a salesman, traveling constantly, while I managed the home. For a while, it felt like a reasonable arrangement. My name's Sophia, and I'm 36. I'd always dreamed of making a living from my art, so I became a freelance illustrator. I worked hard, put myself through college, and built a career in a design firm. When I turned 30, though, I craved freedom, the kind that comes from being your own boss. So I left the company, and when I met David, I thought everything was falling into place. We met through mutual friends, and it was like we clicked instantly. A year later, we were married. He was on the road a lot, and for a while, I thought it made sense for me to focus on our home, giving him the space he needed to thrive in his career. I kept telling myself that it would just be temporary, that one day I'd get back to my art. We were a team after all. But when he was promoted to manage a new office and we moved to a new city, I quickly realized that the idea of stability I'd been sold was a mirage. David's promotion meant we could finally put down roots, but the reality was far different. The office he was supposed to lead wasn't as successful as he had hoped, and with the cost of living in the new city, his salary barely covered our bills. We were scraping by, and I started to wonder how we were going to make it work. I suggested I go back to work, even though I still took on most of the housework. I was more than capable, but he hesitated. When he finally agreed, there was a strange undertone in his voice. It was as if he didn't fully support the idea. As I dove back into my career, things began to shift at home. David, who had never been particularly critical, started picking apart everything I did. The meals I made, the way I cleaned, the way I managed the house, it was all wrong. I was too tired to fight back, too overwhelmed by the weight of his words. He accused me of cutting corners when I bought cheaper ingredients to save money. I tried to explain that we needed to watch our spending, but that only seemed to make things worse. He twisted my words, accusing me of implying that his salary wasn't enough. It was as if I'd become invisible, and everything I did to make things easier was wrong. I didn't want to argue, so I apologized, hoping he'd calm down. But the tension between us only grew. The criticisms became more relentless, more personal. I found myself exhausted, drained not just from working, but from trying to keep up with his impossible standards. When I asked for help, he refused. "You're not working hard enough," he'd say. "This is your job." That phrase, "this is your job," haunted me. I was working just as hard as he was, but all he saw was a housewife who wasn't pulling her weight. His insults were sharp, but his refusal to see the reality of our situation was even sharper. I thought, how could he not see? I wasn't just some woman at home. I was contributing, and yet, in his eyes, it wasn't enough. One day while I was cleaning, I stumbled upon something that made my stomach drop. I found David's old pay stubs tucked away on his desk. Curious, I pulled them out. The numbers didn't match up with what he had been telling me. His salary was much lower than he had led me to believe, and there were discrepancies everywhere. But that wasn't the worst part. There were no pay stubs from before his promotion, only these recent ones. What had changed? My heart sank. That night, David's uncle called. He mentioned that he had lent David a significant amount of money and was wondering when it would be repaid. That was when everything fell into place. David had been using his uncle's money to cover the gap in his salary. He'd lied to me about his promotion, about his pay, and the entire financial situation had been a cover-up. I didn't know what to say. I felt betrayed, angry, and utterly powerless. I didn't mention it to David right away. I needed time to process. But as the days went by, his behavior only got worse. His criticisms became more frequent, more pointed. His response to my work was dismissive, as if everything I did didn't matter. He would belittle me for spending money on the house, yet would refuse to acknowledge that we couldn't live on his salary alone. When I confronted him about the pay stubs, he snapped, accusing me of not supporting him. He turned everything around, twisting my words to make it seem like I was the problem. I had reached my breaking point. I realized that if I didn't stand up for myself, nothing would change. I'd been so focused on trying to make the relationship work that I had forgotten about my own worth. I couldn't keep pretending that everything was okay, that his behavior was justified. One evening, after another argument, I knew what I had to do. I was done. I packed a bag, grabbed the divorce papers I had gotten from the city hall earlier that day, and walked out the door. He stood there, stunned, as I headed for the door. "You can't do anything on your own anyway," he sneered. I turned around, looked him in the eye, and said, "I'm leaving, and I'm not coming back." I slapped the divorce papers on the table, the finality of my decision sinking in. That night, I stayed with my parents, who welcomed me with open arms. I knew the divorce would be hard, but I had no choice. He had shown me who he really was, someone who was unwilling to take responsibility for his actions. And I couldn't live in a relationship where I was expected to carry the burden alone. As the days passed, I focused on what came next. It wasn't just about leaving David, it was about rediscovering myself. It was about remembering who I was before I got lost in his world, before I let his lies shape my reality. And slowly, piece by piece, I began to rebuild. The days that followed my departure were a blur. At first it felt surreal, like I had woken up from a bad dream. I hadn't realized how much weight I had been carrying until it was gone. I moved in with my parents, not because I wanted to, but because I needed space to think. They were angry, not just with David, but with how I had allowed myself to be dragged into his mess for so long. My dad was particularly upset. He offered to help me find a lawyer, but I wasn't sure I even needed one just yet. The divorce papers were already in my hand, and I was determined to follow through. The first few days were quiet. My parents gave me time to settle in. I had to remind myself that I wasn't the same person I had been when I married David. I was still the same person who worked hard to build a career as an illustrator, the same person who had dreams and aspirations. But somewhere along the way, I had let myself fade into the background. I let his constant criticisms become my truth. I allowed his insecurities to become mine until I couldn't see my own worth anymore. But now, I could see it clearly. My art, my career, the things that made me feel alive were still mine, and they could still be my future. I just had to step back into it, and that was the hardest part. David didn't make it easy. One week after I moved out, he showed up at my parents' house. I had no idea what to expect. I wasn't sure if I wanted to talk to him or not, but there he was, standing at the door, looking like he had been through hell. His face was tired, his eyes bloodshot. He was a mess, and I felt a small pang of something, maybe pity, maybe frustration. Either way, I knew this wasn't the man I had married. I opened the door. "Did you fill out the divorce papers?" I asked flatly. There was no room for niceties, no room for anything but business. He looked nervous, like a man who knew he had done something wrong but wasn't ready to admit it. "I'm sorry, Sophia. Please, reconsider the divorce," he said, his voice low, almost pleading. It caught me off guard, but I didn't let it show. He had played me for too long to expect any sympathy now. I stood there for a moment, just staring at him. The world felt too heavy in that moment, but I had learned something I couldn't unlearn. I couldn't keep doing this. I couldn't keep trying to fix him when he wasn't trying to fix himself. "You lied to me, David," I said, the words spilling out before I could stop them. "You lied about your promotion, about your salary, about everything. I can't stay in a marriage built on lies." His face dropped, and I saw a flicker of the man I had once loved, desperate, afraid, broken. But I couldn't let that cloud my judgment anymore. I thought I could keep it all together. I thought I could fix it before you found out. I never meant to hurt you, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. But you did, I replied. You hurt me by keeping me in the dark, by making me feel like I was nothing. I didn't deserve that. There was a long silence between us, filled with so many unsaid things. I wasn't sure what he wanted from me, perhaps forgiveness, or maybe just a second chance, but I wasn't ready for that. Not now. Not after everything that had happened. David, I'm sorry, but this is over, I said firmly, holding my ground. It was then that he finally broke down. His tough exterior crumbled, and he dropped his shoulders. I was demoted, he said quietly, his gaze avoiding mine. There was no promotion. I've been failing at my job for months. I didn't know how to tell you. I wasn't sure what to say. I had suspected something was off, but hearing him admit it out loud felt like a punch to the gut. I didn't know what hurt more, the fact that he had lied to me, or the fact that he had been carrying all of this alone, keeping it from me. I couldn't let you know, he continued. I couldn't let you see how badly things were going. I thought you'd leave me, and I couldn't handle that. I'm sorry. Please understand. It was hard to know how to react. Part of me wanted to feel sorry for him, but another part of me was too angry, too hurt, to care. He had put me in this position. He had made me feel worthless, and now he wanted sympathy because he couldn't face his own reality. I wasn't sure if he was genuinely remorseful or if this was just another attempt to manipulate me. I shook my head, not letting myself fall into that trap again. You're asking me to go back to a life of lies, David. I can't do that. Not for you, not for anyone. You need to figure out your own life, and so do I. My dad, who had been standing behind me, spoke up. You've been dishonest, David. And that's not something I can just overlook. What about the debt? You've been borrowing money from your uncle, haven't you? David's face turned white. Please, don't. No, I cut him off. You're not getting away with that. You need to take responsibility for everything you've done. David didn't say anything for a moment, but I could see him processing it. Finally, he looked up, his eyes filled with something I couldn't name. I know I've messed up. I don't know how to fix it. You can start by being honest, I said coldly. And you need to pay back your uncle. You owe him that much. David's shoulders slumped even further. I don't know how to do any of this without you. I didn't answer right away. For a moment, the silence hung heavy in the air, and all I could think about was how far I had come in just a few days. I had walked away from everything that had once seemed important to find my own worth again. I couldn't go back to a life where I was just an accessory, where my happiness was secondary to his. Finally, I spoke. It's too late for us. I've made up my mind, David, and I'm not going to change it. I'm moving forward, and I need you to do the same. His face twisted in pain. So, that's it? No more chances? No, I said, shaking my head. No more chances. After David left my parents' house that day, things started to settle. But it wasn't peaceful, not at first. I spent the following weeks wrestling with my emotions. There were days when I would wake up and feel the weight of everything that had happened, the lies, the betrayal, the confusion. Other days, it was a relief, like the fog lifting and letting me see the world clearly again. It was a strange, exhausting feeling. I focused on what I could control, my work, my art. It felt like the one part of my life that hadn't been tainted by his manipulation. I started to dive deeper into my freelance career, taking on more projects, pushing myself harder than I ever had before. I realized how much I had neglected my passion for so long, but now it was my anchor. I was building something of my own, something that was mine. No one could take that away. But the divorce wasn't simple. The papers needed to be filed, the debts needed to be sorted out, and the emotional toll was overwhelming. David had called me several times after that day, but I ignored his messages. I couldn't go back. I couldn't unhear the things he had said to me. I couldn't unfeel the way he had made me doubt myself, made me feel like I was the one at fault. I was done. Then, a month after everything had started to fall apart, I got a message from his uncle. He wanted to meet. Part of me wanted to ignore it. I didn't need to get involved in any more of David's mess. But another part of me felt like I needed to know the full picture. So, I agreed to meet him. We sat in a small cafe, not far from my parents' place. His uncle was an older man, someone who had always been kind to me, but now there was a hint of disappointment in his eyes. Sophia, he began, after the usual pleasantries. I just wanted to apologize for my nephew. He's been hiding things from you for a long time. I nodded, waiting for him to continue. "I know you're probably angry," he said, his voice low. "But David, he's been ashamed of the situation. He's not as proud of what happened as he's let on. The debt, the lies, it's been eating at him. I'm not excusing what he's done, but I want you to understand, he's been stuck in a hole for a while now. And I think he's finally seeing it for what it is." I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to scream at him, to tell him that none of this would have happened if David had been honest from the beginning. But there was also a part of me that could understand the struggle David was going through. It didn't excuse his actions, but I could see how someone might lose themselves in the pressure of trying to be something they weren't. "I've told David," his uncle continued, "that he needs to face what he's done, and he needs to start repaying that debt step by step. But I also want you to know, you don't need to take responsibility for any of it. This isn't your burden to carry." I didn't respond right away. I was still processing everything. I had spent so much time trying to fix David, trying to help him carry the load, that it was hard to let go of the idea that maybe I had been a part of his mess. But I knew deep down that this wasn't my fight anymore. I had already walked away. I had already chosen myself. "Thank you," I said finally, my voice steady. "But I'm done. I'm moving forward. And David, he needs to do the same. It's not my responsibility to fix him." His uncle sighed, but he seemed to understand. "I can't make any promises, but I hope you find the peace you're looking for." After that meeting, I felt lighter. I wasn't responsible for David's mistakes anymore. I had carried his weight for too long, and now it was his turn to figure it out. The truth had set me free, and it was time to move forward without any more guilt or shame. Weeks passed, and David's calls became fewer. I heard through mutual friends that he had quit his job, something that didn't surprise me. His whole life had been a facade. He had been pretending to be someone he wasn't. And now, with the divorce finalized and the truth out in the open, he didn't have to keep up the act anymore. At first, I felt a pang of sympathy for him. He was lost. He had made a mess of everything. But as the weeks went by, that sympathy faded. I realized that David wasn't my problem anymore, and it was okay to let go of the guilt that had been weighing me down. I focused more on my career. I took on new projects, experimented with different styles, and even started teaching some online workshops for budding artists. The work I loved was finally giving me the life I had always wanted. I didn't need David's approval. I didn't need anyone's approval. For the first time in years, I was doing something for me. One night, a few months after the divorce, I sat at my desk, looking out the window as the sun set. The sky was painted with warm colors, and I felt a deep sense of peace. I had come so far since walking out that door. The courage I had found in myself, the courage to let go of the life I had known and start something new, had changed me. It had given me back my power. I thought about the future. There were still challenges ahead, of course. Life wasn't perfect, but I knew one thing for sure. I would never settle for less than I deserved. I would never let anyone make me feel small again. As I sat there, reflecting on everything that had happened, I couldn't help but smile. It wasn't just a smile of relief. It was a smile of confidence, of someone who had found their voice again. And this time, I wasn't letting go.